Have you ever found yourself wondering how a small, really passionate group of people just gets its way all the time? Well, from what your family ends up eating for dinner to the names you see on a ballot, there's this powerful and kind of invisible rule at play. In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into this principle of the intransigent few and see how it really does shape the world for every single one of us.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll kick things off with a simple story about a vegan at a dinner party. Sounds random, but stick with me. Then we'll get into the actual science of how minorities can influence majorities, which is pretty surprising. We'll look at what Nassim Taleb calls the minority rule, see how it plays out in the real world, and then finally, we'll ask the big question. Can we design better systems to handle all of this?
All right, let's start with a scene that I bet most of us have been in one way or another. It seems super simple, but it actually holds the secret to this entire idea.
Okay, so picture this. A family of 5 is deciding where to go for dinner. 4 of them, they're totally flexible. They'll eat anything, Italian, burgers, Thai, whatever. But one person is a committed vegan. Now, you'd think the 4-to-1 majority would win, right? But where do they almost always end up? Yep, at a restaurant that has good vegan options. The single most inflexible person completely sets the agenda for the whole group.
And there's a name for this, the asymmetry of preference. Here's the key idea to hang on to. It's not about who has more votes. It's about who has more to lose. See, for the 4 flexible eaters, the cost of going to a vegan-friendly place is super low. They'll find something they like. But for the vegan, the cost of going to, say, a traditional steakhouse is absolute. They literally can't eat. And in that lopsided matchup, the committed minority just wins.
Now, this isn't just some funny little dinner party quirk. Oh no, it's a psychological phenomenon that's been studied for decades. So let's get into the science of how this actually works.
So, back in the 1950s, famous experiments showed how easily people will conform to a group, even when the group is obviously totally wrong. But then, in 1969, this psychologist, Serge Moscovici, decided to flip the whole script. He asked a different question. What happens if a small, stubborn minority digs in its heels? Can they influence the majority?
And the results he got were pretty wild. So, Moscovici showed people a bunch of slides that were clearly blue. But he put 2 actors in each group, and he told them to consistently and confidently insist that the blue slides were green. And get this, the number of people in the majority who started agreeing with them shot up from practically 0 to over 8%. That's a 30-fold increase, all because of the pressure from a tiny but very consistent minority.
And this quote from Moscovici really nails the why. A stubborn minority does more than just annoy people. Their sheer consistency makes the majority stop and think, wait a minute, how can they be so certain about this? And that little question, that moment of doubt, is where real persuasion actually begins. It's not just about giving in, it's about genuinely reconsidering your own view.
So fast forward a few decades. The writer and statistician Nassim Taleb takes this psychological insight, gives it a catchy name, the minority rule, and turns it into something almost like a law of social physics.
And the number he landed on is just shockingly small. Taleb figured out that an intransigent minority, a group that will not budge, only needs to be about 3 to 4% of the population to get its preferences imposed on everyone else. I mean, just think about that for a second. Only 3 or 4 committed people out of 100 can end up dictating the choices for the other 97.
Now, for this rule to really kick in, Taleb says 2 things have to be true. First, that minority has to be genuinely intransigent. For them, it's a total deal breaker. Second, they can't be isolated. Think about it. A self-contained vegan commune doesn't really change the menu at a citywide restaurant chain. But if you have vegans scattered through every office, every family, every friend group, well, now the entire system has to constantly bend to accommodate them. And as Taleb puts it, the whole system just bends. It happens through these little cascading accommodations that add up. One person insists on organic food at a party, and soon the local grocery store changes its entire supply chain to meet demand. The flexible majority, we just kind of go along with it, and a lot of the time we barely even notice that a huge shift just happened.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What happens when you take this powerful social logic and smash it up against systems like democracy, which are supposed to be all about what the majority wants? Well, that's where things get really complicated and sometimes pretty messy.
This right here is the fundamental conflict. You see, democratic logic is all about counting heads. More votes wins, end of story. But social logic, the way we actually behave, is about weighing commitment. The most inflexible person wins. Our official systems are built for the logic on the left, but our daily lives often run on the logic on the right.
And that mismatch, well, it explains a lot about our world today.
And here is a perfect political example of what we're talking about. Political primaries. You've got this small, super committed minority of activist voters, maybe only 15% of everyone, who show up and pick the candidates. The result? They end up pulling the choices way away from the center, leaving the big, flexible majority to choose between options they never really wanted in the first place.
So once you get this rule, all these behaviors that might seem totally irrational from the outside suddenly start to make a whole lot of strategic sense. You know, purity spirals, that's just a way to make sure the group stays 100% committed. Because if you'll accept 90%, you can be talked down. Publicly refusing to compromise, that's just a way to signal that you are absolutely not messing around. It's all about keeping that critical edge of inflexibility.
So what does the flexible majority do in all this? Well, at first, they often just disengage. I mean, why would you bother participating in a system that doesn't seem to reflect your views anyway? But that apathy doesn't last forever. Eventually, when the cost of being ignored gets too high, that quiet majority can suddenly roar back to life, often in pretty clumsy and disruptive ways. Some analysts argue this is part of what we saw in events like Brexit or the 2016 US election.
So this brings us to a really important question. If this minority rule is just a fundamental part of how groups of humans work, is there anything we can do? Can we actually design smarter institutions that manage this tension without letting the most committed voices completely take over the whole system?
Well, people are thinking about this, and there are some pretty fascinating ideas floating around. For instance, something called quadratic voting tries to build that weighing of commitment directly into the system by letting you show how much you care about an issue. Citizens' assemblies try to get around the activist problem by just randomly selecting a true cross-section of the public to make decisions. And even an old idea like federalism can help. By pushing decisions down to a local level, you reduce the stakes of those big national fights.
Now, it is really important to be clear here. None of these are a magic bullet. They're not going to make this fundamental asymmetry of preference just disappear. But what they can do is try to create dedicated spaces and channels for that flexible majority to finally be heard, hopefully making the system a bit more balanced before things get to a boiling point.
And in the end, the source material leaves us with this really powerful thought. The vegan at the dinner party isn't the problem. The intransigent few will always be with us. The real problem, the real danger, is when the system becomes so dominated by them that the vast, flexible majority just gives up, gets quiet, and stops showing up to the dinner table at all, leaving a small, committed group to set the menu for everyone.